Hello, fellow humans, and welcome to Beyond Words, the podcast where we explore the science and experience of language, music, and the mind. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama, a speech-language pathologist, a musician, and a PhD student researcher. In each episode, we'll dive into conversations with world-class researchers, clinicians, and thinkers to uncover how communication really works. From brain and behavior to sound and meaning, we go beyond the traditional boundaries to better understand what it means to connect, express, and be human through this amazing capacity of language. All right. Hey, everyone. How you doing? Happy Thursday. Welcome to Beyond Words. This is conversations on language, music, and mind in collaboration with speechtherapypd.com. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama, and I'm so super excited that we have the one and only Dr. Gedeon Deák with us today. Dr. Gedeon Deák is a professor of cognitive science at the University of California, San Diego, my alma mater. Shout out CCSD, Tritons. His research focuses on cognitive development, including infant learning, parent-infant interaction, joint attention, and cognitive flexibility. His work examines how infants learn to coordinate attention with caregivers, follow gaze and pointing cues, engage with objects, and use social information to support learning and communication. And I think his research is especially relevant for clinicians interested in early social communication and also the foundations of language development. Before we get started, just a couple items to mention. Most of these upcoming podcasts will include an accompanying course on speech therapy PD that is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. We each receive compensation from speech therapy PD, and there are no other relevant non-financial disclosures to report. So without further ado, Dr. Deák, welcome to Beyond Words. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm actually talking to you from one of the other universities in San Diego campus of SDSU, San Diego State University, where I'm here for the day. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
I can sense the good weather from here.
It's pretty nice behind me here, I won't lie.
Nice. Well, I usually ask the guests just a little bit about their origin story. And I'm just wondering what got you interested in the field of cognitive science.
Yeah, well, I started out in a very different direction, music and literature, and took a few psychology classes. And the class that hooked me and got me to declare a psychology major was what we would now call a neuroscience course. I think it was called biological psychology or something. But it was kind of intro to neuroscience for kind of behavioral scientists. And, I was just so fascinated with the fact that, you could do experiments. Of course, most of the experiments were non-human animal-based experiments, basically experimentally demonstrating the mechanisms of some behavior, whether it was water seeking or, social behaviors. It was actually some of the social behavioral experiments and, studies of oxytocin or manipulation of endogenous opiate systems or something like that really got me fascinated as an undergraduate and wanted to learn more about that. So that was kind of the class that hooked me. And then the next class that hooked me was a developmental psychology course taught by Ken Livingston. And I just thought there were a lot of really interesting experiments and questions about how intelligence came to be. And then the next thing was I took a class which was a early education practicum course where there was, one sort of light lecture a week, but then 2 mornings a week I went and worked with these excellent preschool teachers at the in a classroom on the on-campus preschool with 4-year-olds, and it was talking to 4-year-olds that really hooked me. I just thought they were fascinating and hilarious, and they would say such insightful things occasionally, and I didn't have that much experience working with kids, but it was really 4-year-olds who hooked me. And for a number of years, I studied 3 and 4-year-olds cognition. So that was it.
That's awesome. Yeah, 4-year-olds have the best stories.
Absolutely.
Just so awesome. It's so crazy to me. Like, I don't know if it's like homophily or something, but I've just seen so many, like I've talked to so many cog sci folks that just have a music background. Like,
Right.
yeah, it's so interesting. I don't know. Do you see connection there? Is there any link between music and
I don't
developmental
know.
psych?
It's a good question. And by the way, I'm outside and it's a little windy. Are you getting wind noise or is
I'm getting a little bit, but that's okay. I
okay?
think yeah, I can hear
If it
you.
gets bad, let me know and I can just move as we're talking. There's a place I can sit over there, which is more sheltered and probably quieter. But anyway, let me know if it's an issue.
Okay.
Um, So, is there a connection? I think there are a lot of scientists who also, in the background, were really interested in the arts in some form, either visual art or music or theater. I have colleagues who, their hobby is theater or painting. I have a colleague who um, is a novelist or does writes fiction, and
Sure.
so I'm not sure. I mean, I think there are
Yeah.
people in a lot of walks of life who are interested in music and love performing music and like um, so I'm not sure. I don't know the statistics. I don't know whether certain STEM fields or certain disciplines in health sciences tend
Yeah.
to correlate with certain outside interests like hobbies or certain areas of the arts. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. But I'm sorry, Gideon. I was wondering, could you actually move to that other spot? I think
Yeah,
it is the wind is getting a little bit.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll turn off my
Thanks.
camera, but for the moment, but I can keep talking.
No problem. Yeah. So, um, I was wondering if you could maybe describe a bit of your maybe research background and what you're currently studying as well,
Right.
just to give
Well,
some context.
yeah, sure. Well, for the first, I don't know, maybe 15 years of my career, we were doing a lot of work on young children's categorization skills, how they categorize different kinds of things and different kinds of experiences. And I was always interested as part of that, the role that language played. So I was also interested in particularly vocabulary development and semantic development. So insofar as my interest in children's language goes, primarily I've been interested in semantics and pragmatics, but I started with semantics and particularly with word learning and vocabulary growth kinds of issues. And a lot of what I worked on for the first 15 years or so of my career was doing studies that basically disconfirmed some old school beliefs about children's cognitive abilities that actually went back to Jean Piaget's theories and claims. Um, and what that then got me into working on executive functions. So actually, even when I was doing my doctoral thesis, was on kind of cognitive flexibility, because one of the first things we found when we started studying children's categorization skills, it was that children could categorize things in many different ways, which of course we do as well. And this was reflected in their language, and it was also reflected in their non-linguistic judgments. Um, and so cognitive flexibility has been lumped under the sort of umbrella of this vague set of cognitive skills called executive functions, or sometimes cognitive control. There are several different terms and different definitions. Now there are some instruments that are supposed to be able to predict individual differences in these skills. To me, the research doesn't strongly support the idea that cognitive flexibility is a sort of independent, overarching or broadly generalized cognitive capacity. The last work I did in that area was basically saying, look, we sometimes find weak, moderate correlations between two tasks, but only if they're really testing within the same domain, the same kind of skill. Um, And so there's a lot of interest in cognitive flexibility. And there are sometimes claims that I think go beyond the available data. But anyway, that's what I worked on for a long time. And then I got really interested through research, kind of side research. I started in graduate school with Ann Pick and Ross Flom on joint attention. And we studied joint attention in the laboratory for a number of years until I really got dissatisfied with how everyone was, including us, was studying it in the laboratory using very artificial paradigms, and being really concerned that the kinds of really well choreographed sequences of events and actions that we were setting up to get infants to share attention. So let me stop and just make sure. I don't know your audience, but let me define a couple of things. I'll define joint attention, then I'll go back and define executive functions. But joint attention is the tendency to shift your attention to something and maybe maintain your attention on something because you notice that somebody else or another organism is attending to it. So it's kind of socially driven regulation of attention, and attending to something because you notice somebody else attending to it. And then backing up to what I was talking about before, executive function is typically defined as a set of cognitive skills that are used to regulate your other cognition. So, for example, if when you're trying to learn material, some kind of new material, you stop to rehearse it periodically, or you try to eliminate distractions in your environment so you can focus your attention on it, those strategies are based on executive functions. So they reflect your ability to kind of regulate your own cognitive processes. And they're kind of tied to, in part, perhaps, knowledge of your cognitive processes or metacognition. And then this is something that in young children, develops quite a bit. Young children actually have very poor metacognitive skills. If you just ask them, they don't seem to recognize their own cognitive limitations. And they're also not as good as most adults are at regulating our cognitive activity. So anyway, that's going back and defining a couple things. But anyway, back to joint attention. So we were studying in the laboratory and we found some cool results, but I became increasingly dissatisfied between what I was concerned was a real disconnect between the kind of choreographed interactions we would set up in the laboratory, where we'd have like a bare laboratory with targets set up at really precise locations, and we would have
so different than the home.
So different than the home, that's right. And we'd have either a parent who was trained or an experimenter who was trained, to deliver cues at particular times and particular kinds of cues, either turn and look at a target or point to a target or maybe both, and wait a certain number of seconds to see if the baby followed, and turn to look at that same target. And that's a nicely controlled kind of paradigm. But we had a very strong intuition that didn't match what happened in everyday environments very well. So soon before I went up for tenure, I decided to start trying to study joint attention and attention sharing in the wild, and try to understand how these interactions actually unfold in natural infant-parent interactions, and that's what we've been doing ever since. By the way, now there's no wind noise, but a bunch of kids have started skateboarding down here. So this is a naturalistic environment.
This is the natural, exactly the same
Absolutely.
thing.
This is studying, cognition in the wild. So if the skateboarding sounds become too loud, I'll move again. I can just walk around as we're talking. It's fine. I'm flexible.
Yeah, the skateboards are actually, I can't hear them very.
Okay, so
like wind. I think the wind was hitting the AirPods or something. So
but Zoom filters out a lot, so it filters out skateboards. I don't know if they had to train their filters to do that, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's so great. I'm glad you mentioned this is a perfect segue because one thing that I really wanted to talk about was that joint attention is just, it's often treated as just this milestone in speech
Mm,
therapy. Like it's this box you tick, like, we're doing a screener and like, hey, this kid's got joint attention, let's tick the box,
mm,
or maybe they
mm.
don't. And, maybe it's conflated with something like eye contact or something like that. And one thing that I thought was so awesome from your research is that, this kind of blew my mind, which is that infants really aren't looking at faces. So, when you are um, studying in the wild, you start to notice that, hey, when there's like not just a blank background, maybe infants aren't really looking at faces or eyes as much as we thought. I think you mentioned like 12% or something like that
What?
versus a lot, maybe looking at holding objects or manipulating objects with a lot more
Right.
fluency.
When we went into the lab and in a couple of other, went into the home rather than the lab, and a couple of other labs did the same thing in North American middle class households. And I need to stress that we now know that the patterns of shared and non-shared attention between infants and caregivers do vary across environments, across different cultural practices. Our work has really been done exclusively in our lab in kind of North American middle class homes. Primarily what we researchers now call weird population sample. Weird is an acronym that I didn't come up with. It's much discussed. It stands for white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic populations who are vastly, vastly overrepresented relative to the world's populations in psychological, behavioral, and cognitive research and medical research. Vastly overrepresented. And it's a big problem in research that our research 90% of our research is done on like 10% of the world's population.
Right, right.
Um, I mean, I think by any standards that should be considered a problem. So this is a complicated problem um, that would require more time than our whole meeting to talk about. But anyway, um, we know the most about attention sharing in that kind of population from the United States and Western Europe, though there is a growing body of research on attention sharing in very, a range of other populations around the world, which is great that literature is growing and really important. But in North American middle class households, in dyadic interactions, that is, interaction between an infant and a caregiver, several labs found that, yeah, infants spend well less than 20% of the time seated, I should say seated infants in some kind of seat, because posture matters for this, spend well less than 20% of the time looking at caregivers' faces. Now, to people who don't study, infants and know the infant behavioral research, that might not mean anything. But what you have to understand is that going back to the beginning of infant behavior, almost the beginning of infant behavioral research, there was some in the beginning of the 20th century, but it really took off like in the 1960s, right? And from the beginning, one of the biggest topics that was studied was infants' attention to faces and how they processed faces. And there were all these arguments and a ton of studies and literature and people going back and forth about how infants looked at faces and how the way that they attended to faces changed as they got older. But the underlying assumption is that what infants really love are faces. And that came from some old studies in the 60s by Bob Fance, who showed infants different patterns. And this is like reproduced in every developmental psychology intro textbook. So you can find these pictures really easily. Just find any developmental psychology textbook. They're in there, and he showed them like bullseyes and checkerboards and a schematic face, just like a cartoon face, and found that infants prefer moderately complex patterns, and one of the kinds of patterns they prefer to look at are these schematic faces. But see, that's compared to like a gray square or maybe, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
black and white bands, or something like that. And by the way, all of that research was done using different standards than today. So it kind of ignores the variability in that, so there's a lot of variability. And actually, there's a lot of variability between infants and between sessions with the same infant and trial by trial in the same
Mm.
infant. So, um, yeah, if you give infants a bunch of boring things to look at, they will look at schematic faces more than some things. But in a real rich environment like a home or something like that, or, a clinic or a lab, or even like a laboratory waiting room, they don't spend that much time looking at people's faces. And now people like Karen Adolph at NYU and her colleagues and others have done research on putting head-mounted cameras on babies of different ages with different locomotor status, and found that as infants get older and their locomotion changes, um, the amount of time there's a face in their visual field changes, but it's almost always quite low. And they only have faces in their visual field when we get in there and get down and
Mm.
get our faces in their face. That's when they see our
Yeah, yeah.
faces. Now, passively, around the world, traditionally in a lot of societies, babies are carried on the hip in a sling. And when they're awake, they're sometimes carried so that they're facing up and may see like the bottom of their parent's face and see their parent's face as the parent is going about their daily activity and talking to other adults. Um, and there's societies where adults really don't talk to babies directly. So the infant's exposure to language is coming from them overhearing conversations between adults and older children. But anyway, so it's not that babies never see faces, but the first part of that is that under their own steam in normal circumstances, at least in some societies, they don't see faces very much until we get our faces in their face. And the other thing
Yeah.
is that when infants are looking at a scene and there are different things to look at, including a face, even a caregiver's face, which in a stark laboratory test they'll show a weak preference for, a weak but statistically reliable
Reliable.
preference. But in a rich dynamic environment, they do not choose to look at caregivers' faces more than almost any other discrete object. So if there's a toy just sitting there, they'll look at that toy for as much or more time than the face. The thing that we found and other people have validated that infants like looking at the most is other people manipulating objects. That's
Yeah,
what they really
it's
like
cool
looking at.
finding.
Yeah, we're homo habilis, right? We're tool users, and infants are oriented to see what people are doing with things, which is a vastly, vastly understudied thing in the infancy and child development literature. As I argued in a very whiny review paper I wrote how long ago was that? More than 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And there's a little more research on that, but it's really ignored. Praxis development is almost completely ignored in the developmental literature. Praxis meaning practical skills, doing
Practical.
things with
Yeah.
things, which we evolved these
Yeah.
things for, right? These are really
Right.
important things. We use them a lot. We use language a lot, but we use these a lot, and we know there's a motor development literature, and there's literatures where people study this, and there have been some cool in-depth studies of how infants learn to use spoons, which are really fun things to read because infants hold spoons all different ways for a long time until they converge upon whatever way is the conventional way of holding them in their community. But anyway, there's a little research on this, but to me, a still stunningly small amount relative to the fact that in every culture, right, there's two things that differentiate humans, that all humans in every society do, and that differentiate us from non-human primates, is that we use a very large array of tools relative to even communities of non-human primates that have the most abundant and diverse tool use. And of course, we use a very different symbolic signaling system than even primates that use the most kinds of gestures and vocal signals and things like that. So we
Yeah,
study
such a cool
language a
finding.
lot, but we don't study the other thing that humans do much more so than any of our evolutionary close relatives.
Right. Yeah. And, I think this is so important to understand, like for a couple of different reasons as a therapist, just because one, we're like doing a lot of different kinds of assessment and evaluation at these early stages. And,
Mhm.
if you assume that joint attention is just this, like, looking at the face or mutual eye gaze or something like that, then you're going to miss a lot of the kind of, well, number one, you're going to think that there's something wrong, like maybe when it's just normal behavior
Mhm.
and the child is looking more at objects and hands. And then also, you might be, um, oh, in an intervention sense, you might be doing things that aren't as visually rewarding for the child, and you could be taking advantage of that as well. I was
Mhm.
thinking about it, like when I
Absolutely.
was reading this, just that, it is so, I had never thought about this before, but like the manipulating objects, it's like really there's so much information there. It's like informationally rich for the child because you're learning about like hidden object affordances. Like maybe you don't
Absolutely.
know that like the object can do this
Absolutely.
thing. And
Yeah.
then, it's creating like your hands are creating causal information.
Hmm.
There's like all this visual stimuli. They're learning
Hmm.
physics and
Hmm.
all this
Yep.
stuff. It's so rich. And I never thought about that before that
And
like you're
the conventional practices of the experts in your community, right? You're the novice. You're the universal novice
right.
as the infant. And what do people do? Well, they make sounds out of their face holes, and because they do so in a patterned way, you eventually, you're going to start to clue in on this. And the other thing they do is they do things with things all day, right? And that's in a way like the most obvious, because there are these causal connections, right? So the most obvious thing that people around babies are doing, that babies can observe and respond to and notice and learn about, is doing things with things. They make sounds out of their face holes while they're doing that sometimes. And so eventually, infants, if everything goes well, will make sense of that. Um, but we don't study the other thing that's right in front of us, and that happens in every human community and culture that researchers, anthropologists, whoever has ever observed, and that's how do infants make note of what people are doing?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, you think
Yeah.
about like, I was a guitar teacher for a long time, and it's like, yeah, you gotta play the guitar so they could watch your fingers move, and
Hmm.
yeah. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this computational model that you had discussed. I think it's with Dr. Jasso,
Hmm.
and this is about how you can think of some of these like social, what they thought of as kind of social stuff, where gaze following and things like that. How it can sort of maybe emerge from these more simple rules like reinforcement learning. I
Right.
thought that was interesting because I had never thought of gaze following as something that was learned, and maybe something that is experience dependent, which is like always as a therapist, I'm thinking like as a clinician, I'm thinking like, hey, how can we um, change the environment or change what we're doing in a way that might positively impact these like foundational skills, and gaze following might be one of those things. Um,
Right.
but yeah, it's a tricky thing to wrap your head around. I was wondering if maybe you
Yes.
can um, describe that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. One of the things that I think I would want to impress, and that I do try to impress in all of the undergraduate classes that I teach, because there's so much miseducation in the standard psychology curriculum. And one of the things that's been most damaging, in my opinion, in the field of developmental psychology and other areas of psychology, but developmental psychology should be the bulwark that prevents it. And instead, it's been the agent that has promulgated it. And that's the idea that the terms innate and instinct mean anything scientifically. Informally, in everyday vernacular, they may mean something. But from a rigorous scientific framework for understanding how behaviors develop or how any trait develops from a biological sciences perspective, those words have no defensible meaning. They don't add any information. So what I want to convey is that there are two things that are innate, arguably. One is inarguable, and that's the genome. And the other thing that's arguably innate is the epigenome. That is the modifications of the genome that occur between fertilization and, well, actually before fertilization to some extent, in gametogenesis, and then during fertilization, that affect how the genome is expressed in certain ways. Those are the only things that can be said to be innate. Everything else is a product of experience. It's a product of an interaction of some history of experiences with the expression of the genome. Because what makes any one cell different from another cell is its proteome. That is the pattern of proteins that are expressed in it and the way that they change what that cell does. And this is true of neurons in every cell. Anyway, so, and what happened, especially in the 1980s and 1990s in the field of developmental psychology, is that people started arguing that really complex cognitive phenotypes were innate, which enough was known about genetics at that time that should never have been taken seriously. But it really was. And the reason it was is that in psychology, people don't learn enough about biology, just in general, historically. And that's a big problem. But anyway, okay, I'm showing everyone that I'm kind of a crank here. But anyway, so anytime, I guess the takeaway is anytime you see a behavior, the question should be, how does it emerge by some interaction between the already existing traits of the organism, some predispositions in its genome, and the set of experiences that that organism is going through over time. So every trait, every behavior is the snowballing unfolding of a history of experiences that a ever-changing organism is being exposed to. Okay, so let's take a trait like a tendency to shift your gaze in the direction that you see another person looking, following gaze, or something like that. We can ask, why might that happen? And our strategy was to say, unlike other researchers who are studying this, who inferred that, well, this must be some special innate ability of humans, but that whole phrase, innate ability of humans, cannot be understood. There's no scientifically defensible way to understand that phrase because behaviors are not encoded in the genome, right? Nor in fact is a particular cell encoded in the genome or any particular protein. Actually, every protein is a complex product, not just of the genome, but of transcriptional and post-transcriptional processes, right? So even a given polypeptide strand is not specifically encoded in the genome. It's a product of something that happened as a result of some strand of chromatin interacting with a bunch of other protein structures. So anyway, so then how can we understand how something like joint attention could develop? And our very simple answer, this was with Jochen Trisch originally, who's now at the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Studies, and does fascinating work and on a lot of interesting topics. But anyway, we said, well, what you then have to do is you have to look at the organism before they start following gaze and say, well, what traits does this organism already have? What learning abilities do they have? What perceptual skills do they already have? What predispositions do they have? What kinds of things do they like or not like, right? And then you have to know something about their environment. What are they exposed to? And what you want to do is try to see if you can come up with a model, right, of how some agent, some creature with those phenotypes, those abilities and those predispositions and those, perceptual skills and learning skills and so forth that exist in younger infants before they start to follow gaze. If an organism with those traits was exposed to these events, right, to a regimen of these events in their environment, what might they possibly learn? And so our computational model said, well, here's what they have. Here's what infants have. They have certain perceptual abilities. They tend to, they can shift their attention, right? That's actually a skill that develops, the ability to shift your attention in the first few months of life. They can see with a certain level of acuity. They can make out faces. We know that they have some interest in faces. They can also learn. We know that infants can learn, very young infants can learn in certain ways. They undergo operant conditioning. If they're rewarded for some behavior, they do it more. And so on and so forth. And we sort of listed these things, but we didn't know about the environment because at that time, nobody was going in and looking in a lot of detail at what was happening in infants' environments before bouts of joint attention, began. So we started doing that. We started collecting data on that in the home, doing what we call microbehavioral cognitive ethnography. It's kind of long term, but microbehavioral means you're studying behaviors, but you're studying the microstructure of those behaviors, say frame by frame, right, instant by instant. And cognitive ethnography is taking ethnographic practices, which came originally from social anthropologists and cognitive anthropologists, but you're doing it through a sort of cognitive science framework where you're kind of operationalizing things more carefully and you're defining behaviors that you think are relevant. And that's a whole topic, right? How do you develop a cognitive ethnographic study? So we were doing that for infant-parent interactions. And so we recorded a lot of interactions between infants and parents. We recorded where they were looking, what they were doing with their hands, what was going on, in the environment. And then, we frame by frame would code those interactions to see when infants and parents were looking at the same thing or looking at different things and what they were looking at and who looked first. When did the mom look at something and the infant followed? When did the infant look and then the parent followed? And we also did other things like coded when the parent said something or when the parent touched something with their hands or touched the baby. So we coded a whole bunch of behaviors and crunched a lot of numbers. So that was one side of it, so that we could behaviorally test the model that we came up with. And the model that we came up with, kind of to put it in a nutshell, was that we assumed that infants were reinforced. That is, they like seeing certain things. And when I say reinforced, you think about, giving a rat a Cheerio or giving a kid an M&M.
Right.
That is a reinforcer. But another reinforcer is getting to see something interesting, right? I mean, some of us really like to go to the museums to see, art or something like that. And we'd rather do that than have a day at work or something like that, right? So there are certain visual experiences that are rewarding to us, right? And
those objects, the object manipulation.
Right, that's right. And so the hypothesis we had is that because we know, because we're primates, we're apes, right? We're a species of ape, and we do things with our hands, and we tend to look at our hands, and then we sometimes look at infants. Our hypothesis was that, well, maybe infants learn to follow gaze because parents are sometimes looking at what they're doing with their hands, and infants find that interesting, rewarding to look at, right? Interesting means rewarding to look at, right? And then the parents' faces are interesting to look at. So maybe just if you're looking between things, right? Because you habituate over time. So you look at one thing that's interesting, but over time it gets less interesting. So then you look around for something else interesting to look at. So if you keep shifting your attention between two interesting percepts, right? You might notice a correlation between things in your environment. And the correlation would be something like, well, here's an interesting object. Let me see if this comes across. here's an interesting object in the environment. Here's somebody's face where the eyes can be pointed in different directions, right? And they could be pointed there, all over the place, backwards, but occasionally it's going to be pointed at the thing that's interesting. The eyes are going to be pointed at the thing that's interesting. Now, if we were random lookers, there'd be no correlation between where we were looking and where interesting things are, but we're not, because we're tool users and we look at things that other humans find interesting, objects, that complex objects that we can do things with. So if infants are looking back and forth between interesting things, that is people's faces, and interesting objects, they might notice correlations between the direction of gaze, that is the angle of somebody's head, and where interesting things are, because the people in their environments are also looking at interesting things. We're from the same species, we find the same things interesting to look at, right? That was the basic insight. And then we crunched all the data that we collected through our microbehavioral cognitive ethnographic methods and found that, in fact, infants were doing that. Infants didn't look at parents' faces much, but when they did look at parents' faces, infants were disproportionately looking at an interesting object that the parent was also handling, because we tend to look at our hands when we're doing things. And the next thing infants looked at was the thing that overall they find most rewarding, which is the parent doing something with their hand. So we showed, this is the first study, I believe, that showed in a naturalistic data that there is a sort of naturally accumulating reward signal for following a behavioral cue. That is, if you occasionally glance at your caregiver's face when they're not looking at you, they will tend to be looking at something in the environment that is among the most interesting things to you, and that is disproportionately likely to be the next thing you'll look at. So you are rewarded for following the direction of your caregiver's gaze. And you don't need to propose another special skill built into the brain to explain how that skill might emerge. You do need to have an environment where caregivers are behaving like normal humans.
Right. Yeah. That's one thing I wanted to ask. Like, given, that now that digital devices are becoming more prevalent, or, like the way that
Yes.
homes are changing, I mean, I think it has to be potentially messing with this loop, right? There's less back and forth, maybe. Maybe the visual or the stimuli are so visually stimulating that you don't want to look away, find
Yeah.
the other statistics, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I should say, so we did a bunch of, computational simulations, sometimes using our human data, as sort of the input to the models to test these hypotheses. And you mentioned Hector Hasso, who was a graduate student at UCSD, a PhD student in computer science, actually, but working with Jochen Triesch and myself, and he did a very nice, the initial computational model was done by Jochen and a number of us. And then Hector's doctoral thesis followed up on that. And it's really, really nice work showing that this very simple, what we call reinforcement learning model could replicate a whole bunch of particular laboratory findings from different studies that captured various particular ways that infants tend to look at caregivers or follow their gaze. So it showed this very simple model that that started with a small set of learning and perceptual and preferential phenotypes that you find in like typical 3-month-old infants, when given a sort of typical training set taken from the sequence of looking and object manipulation behaviors that parents do, would learn pretty quickly, actually, to follow gaze. In the
So cool.
wild, it's a sparse teaching signal. That is, infants don't see that particular sequence that I explain very often, where they look up the caregiver's face. The caregiver isn't looking at them, but is looking at the next thing the infant looks at. It doesn't seem to happen that often. Actually, it happened actually kind of rarely in our data, and probably even even so, more often that would happen in globally in more representative environments. And I think that might be why it takes infants many months to learn to follow gaze,
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
it's a teaching signal, but it's a very rare teaching signal.
Hmm.
So infants can learn it. Now, in the computational model, of course, we're running it on computers, and we can accelerate the training, so it does learn it, but it learns it very gradually, even in the really simplified computational models. So
Yeah, that's so cool.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
it
and
was
this
fun.
seems like a clear sort of connection to learning language, right? Because you're then not only is the caregiver giving these cues, maybe they're manipulating an object, but they're also providing that auditory signal, like here's what this thing is, or and so they're making these like correlations, and or infant is more likely to follow the gaze to get the rich information that includes that auditory
Right.
signal. So this is really, I think, foundational to learning language. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so going back to the early 90s, like Dare Baldwin at University of Oregon and others were starting to ask these questions about how joint attention could be related to language learning. Does establishing joint attention help infants form an association between a novel word and an object? And her initial very cool studies showed that by like 1.5 years of age, yeah, infants were a little more likely to show some trace of an association between a novel word and an object if they had been jointly attending to it with the person who said the word when they were both looking at the object. Um, so a lot of the work we've done since then has been looking at how language is incorporated in these naturally occurring everyday interactions, because there's of course a lot that caregivers are doing. They're not just sitting in chairs and rotating their heads towards isolated targets. We're talking, we're gesturing, we're doing stuff. And the infants are doing stuff too. The infants may be distracted by there's stuff on their high chair tray, so they're doing stuff too. So it's a much more multidimensionally complex environment, and we want to know how the signal in that environment is sort of coalescing in certain instances, or kind of not exactly snapshots but snippets of interactions that may
Hmm.
occur with enough regularity that is boosting some kind of learning. So how is language in real time being incorporated into these interactions so that infants can start to build those associations that, like Dare Baldwin showed, 18-month-olds can learn in these kind of controlled experimental tasks. How is that really happening? Because of course, by 18 months, typically developing, infants already have been learning language. And now we know from work by Bergelson and others that even, before, by 6 to 9 months, infants are starting to be above chance in recognizing associations between a handful of words and their reference. So it's of course happening more early, much earlier. And then how are those initial word object associations, or I should say word referent associations, because not all object labels, but
Yeah.
I mean, many of the first words are object labels, but not all. But anyway, how are those initially learned associations starting to coalesce in the interactions, right, where infants are hearing them? And if you look at lists of first 50 words, things like words for parents, bottle, um, things like dog or kitty, if they're pets around the house. There are also words like up or things like that. So they're words that go with very repetitive kinds of interactions, that infants are experiencing every day. And but we don't exactly know how that learning is happening. It sort of all makes sense,
Hmm.
intuitively. There's nothing surprising, but yeah, what is exactly happening? What are people doing with the bottles? Where are those bottles showing up, and how? You know, for the infant, from the infant's perspective, that when the word when somebody utters the word bottle, right? And something's happening, somebody's giving them a bottle or filling their bottle or what is happening, so that eventually they learn that association. Um,
Yeah. I
and
really, yeah,
yeah, we
it's so
don't know a
mysterious.
whole lot about that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
it's really cool to think about. Um, I think a lot of clinicians maybe tend to think, like I was mentioning in the beginning, we tend to think of joint attention as just sort of like, oh, there's this sort of like monolithic. It's this like one skill, but really breaking it down like into these more specific dyadic states that you might call them is really for me was helpful in thinking about, okay, what are some potential things that parents are already doing, and also if they're not doing that, to maybe encourage them to do so. Like, for example, I think one common state that is that caregivers will watch an infant while an infant is looking at someone else or something else, like
Hmm.
very often. And this is sort of I was thinking of it as like a surfer waiting for a wave or something. Like you got to wait for the right opportunity. So if at Black's Beach, you got to be in the right spot. If you want to catch a wave, you want to be in the right spot. So,
And if you're a
waiting
new
for those
surfer, you're
opportunities.
probably going to watch the experienced surfers to see what they do, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So
Look where
yeah,
they're
two
looking.
ways.
If you see all the experienced surfers looking over there and you're a newbie, right? You
Right.
probably are going, what's happening there? What's starting to develop out there?
Totally.
I
Yeah.
mean, so yeah, something that some of your listeners may have run into is the idea that like in ASD, autism spectrum disorder, there are different kinds of joint attention. As you mentioned, there's when we're talking about gaze following, we're talking about following into joint attention. There's also leading joint attention, and caregivers join a lot into what infants are attending to. And there's been a lot of interest and back and forth in the roles of infants following adults' attention versus the role of adults following into infants' attention in helping potentiate different kinds of learning. And the fact that, I mean, one of the fairly robust findings is that kids who are later diagnosed with ASD don't try to get adults' attention, don't try to get uh, adults interested in things. It's now known from work by Sue Leakham and others that kids who are like preschoolers who are provisionally diagnosed with ASD can follow joint attention, will follow gaze if you reward them for it. And other work by like Brooke Ingersoll when she was here as a graduate student, very cool work showing that you can get in behavioral therapy interventions, you can get preschoolers to follow attention. And the way you do it is to imitate them initially so that they find you a really predictable kind of object, I mean, among other
Mhm.
things. I'm really oversimplifying this very cool work. But anyway, so um, it's not that at least higher functioning kids with ASD can't follow attention. They don't tend to. And the question is why? Does that have to do with the reinforcement contingencies, the way that what they're rewarded for, more or less relative to, typically developing infants or infants without ASD? So there are different forms of attention sharing, which may have different functions and different roles in learning. Um, and may be important in different kinds of interactions in different kinds of contexts. Like, if I'm just going out to surf and I don't know how to surf, I should be following attention, right? Because I'm the
Yeah.
novice. I want to see what the experts are doing, what they're looking at. I want to know what they're attending to, right? Um, Right.
Would-
Whereas if I'm a parent trying to teach kid words for things, I might look for the things they're interested in, wait till they're attending to them, and then do something.
Yeah.
Maybe play
Mm.
with the object with them and use the word repeatedly, right, for that object, let's say, or the action we're doing as they're doing it while they're interested in it, because that's the best chance of, their attention is on the right thing. So there's at least a shot here at starting to build an association. And one of the things I would also point out is that, yeah, there were these early findings about like fast mapping in word learning that, oh, kids can learn words on 1 or 2 repetitions. That is a thing that can happen, but it's not how most vocabulary growth happens. Most vocabulary growth happens very, very slowly. I have a paper with Alexis Tony where we showed that it isn't cited that much, I think partly because it goes against what everyone thinks and likes, but it basically shows that preschoolers are terrible at learning words compared to adults, and they mostly don't do fast mapping of words, even if you give them really clear associative, you know, trials where they can see the association. Young kids are much slower word learners than we are as adults. We have a lot more associations we can build on to learn a new word.
Yeah.
And you may even have had the experience as you're learning a second or third language. The more you learn of that language, the easier word learning becomes, because now you have the phonological scaffolding, you have the semantic scaffolding, you have other cognates that you can, you know, use as
Yeah.
sort of, you know, to buttress, you know, a new association with a new word. So you need
Mm.
a lot of repetitions. So don't count on fast mapping. That's what I would say. Fast
Yeah.
mapping is a fun phenomenon that people found. It happens sometimes, but the amount people talk about it relative to how important it is for vocabulary growth is way out of proportion.
Yeah. One fact that always stood out to me was from that Birth of the Word, the Deb Roy
The
study.
Deborah thing. Yeah,
He
yeah,
said
yeah.
like, you know, it was like over 17,000, like his kid heard the word water
Yep,
17,000 times
yep,
before ever producing it. It's like
yep.
we're really missing out. Like people think this is like this magical, mystical thing of like we're
Yeah.
just gonna automatically learn this word, and kids are like sponges, you know, they're just
Mhm.
picking it up. But there's so much going on in the background. I think a lot of
So
your work
yeah,
is really illuminating that.
yeah,
So
and you know, as you know, we've talked about, you know, long form recordings, and there's this wave of people doing cognitive ethnographic research who are really dissatisfied with the kind of methods that we initially used, which was to collect like 10, 15, 20-minute videos from the home, which are snapshots of what happens during the kid's day. And I would say this goes, you know, for infant research, but also research of typically developing kids in different cultures and kids with different kinds of disabilities. We haven't yet talked about joint attention in special populations, kids with different kinds of sensory abilities and limitations. And there are now there's small but growing literatures on joint attention in kids with, you know, auditory, you know, deficits and visual deficits. And how do they establish joint attention, but what do they use to do it? Well, it's a different, it's got to be a different profile of kind of social cues that they're learning. Um, you know, so yeah, there's you know, the Deb Roy studies are really were fascinating. So Deb Roy, researcher at MIT, who had basically unlimited research money, you know, and equipped his whole house with sensors, right, cameras and recorders, and for a year or more recorded everything that their son, while in the house, experienced and heard and saw. A very cool experiment. It's kind of an extreme experiment that somebody was able to do in microbehavioral cognitive ethnography. Well, we can't usually do that. So what we're doing instead is trying to figure out accessible ways to collect long form recordings, maybe a few hours rather than, you know, a few minutes in length, to record what infants and children around the world are experiencing during a typical day, and then also trying to figure out methods, because those are huge data sets, enormous and intractably large and cumbersome data sets. And so we need to figure out ways to streamline extracting the relevant social information about what's going on in those environments during those hours of interaction. So that's a very you know, cusp of the field area of research is trying to figure out. I mean, everyone now acknowledges, well, we've been in the laboratory, we've been barking up a bunch of wrong trees, and we don't really know what's going on in children's everyday environment and how they learn. So a bunch of people have started doing that, and it's been really fascinating and great and exciting to watch. And now we're all going, man, it is so time consuming to do this work, because the micro behavioral cognitive ethnography means spending thousands and thousands of hours going frame by frame through videos and recordings. And, so how can we leverage, one of the few good things that these days that it seems that comes out of AI is leveraging AI tools to accelerate research by accelerating the process of trying to extract patterns like words, speech, when faces are showing up in camera views and, kind of head-mounted cameras that infants can wear and things like that, so that we can find out what infants are experiencing and not wait, 10 years for every data set to get the results. So accelerating that research, I think, is really
Yeah.
important. And there are groups like Hannah D'Souza's group at Cardiff, who are doing this with kids with different populations of kids with different kinds of developmental syndromes like Down syndrome. And that is a really exciting set of projects they're doing there, Hannah D'Souza, Dean D'Souza, and their colleagues, and learning really important things about the everyday experiences and social experience of kids with different profiles of developmental disabilities. So yeah, I want to shout out that
Yeah.
those are
Yeah.
that's a really important, I think, frontier in this area.
Yeah, that's fabulous. I can write that in. But thank you for the work you're doing. And I'm
Absolutely.
bummed we're running out of time. I wish yeah, I have so many more questions. But
Sorry, I go on. I get excited, and
no, this is great. It was like there was a biology lesson too in there. It was great. Yeah, thank you so much for your work and coming on the show and talking with me. Yeah, if people want to get involved, can they contact you, or is there anything that you'd like to add, or
well, I would say, I mean, sure, people can reach out to me. My email is, you can put it in the
I
notes,
can put it in there?
Gdeak at ucsd.edu. There are a lot of people around a number of labs, a growing number of labs around the world that are doing exciting research like that. I say Chen Yu's lab at UT Austin, University of Texas at Austin. I mentioned the D'Souza's. There's a lab in Paris that Alex Christia has been the director of. That's been the leaders in collecting, long form recordings of what kids are hearing all day long. Um, and I know you know because you work with Ann Worlemont at UCLA, and she's been a pioneer also in trying to understand, what infants are experiencing in their language environment and figuring out ways to capture the patterns of what kids are hearing, babies are hearing in their everyday speech environment. So there are a number of labs doing this kind of work. Bria Long, a colleague of mine in the psychology department at UCSD, is part of a group that's developed kind of head-mounted, kind of camera
Oh,
and
cool.
video camera and recorder set up to also study these things. So yeah, there are number of labs around the world that I would suggest people look into and read about their research and find out more about the really fascinating. Really, every month new papers are coming out that I'm learning things from that nobody knew. Nobody knew because we couldn't do research on this scale. It was too time consuming and laborious.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to see, do these seem like um, takeaways that make sense? Like one being that, we should reduce joint attention to this like one, thing that we tick off in a box or eye contact. It's really maybe more of this very rich dynamic process and
Hmm.
can take many forms. And a lot of
Yes.
these forms can also help kids to develop these skills like gaze following or these pre-linguistic skills that are very important. Um, Other things might be to take advantage of this idea that kids are interested in object manipulation and not just faces, and you could use
Right.
that as a teaching moment.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, one thing I was wondering too, maybe this is just an anecdotal thing that I've felt in, working with kids in their homes, is that I often felt like the kids that had more severe profiles, their homes were super visually cluttered. There's like stuff everywhere. And I wondered if like environmental, sort of manipulation has any impact on these kinds of things, like maybe learning to do gaze following or
Yeah, so that was one of the things that struck us, and we did a sort of early study around back in 2008 with Ted Walden and colleagues at Vanderbilt University, where we found that by by necessity we were using a sort of cluttered room as our experimental space, and it more kind of resembled a home or maybe a preschool classroom, than a typical laboratory setting. And in that setting, 15 and 21-month-olds didn't follow gaze, but if you added a point, they followed it. So gestures are more effective at directing infants' attention than head turns or gaze direction. Now there's this little literature on clutter, in children's learning, not just infants, but also like say in classrooms, because teachers like to put up lots of posters and have lots of cool toys around. But is there anything kind of distracting or anything potentially disadvantageous for certain kinds of cognitive activities or tasks or outcomes? There's not a huge literature in it, so I'm a little bit leery to draw any big conclusions. And there are a couple people who have started to try to use machine vision methods to try to quantify the degree of visual clutter in different environments.
Interesting.
Yeah,
that's cool.
It is. Of course, those are using like low level features or like, reducing visual scenes to Gaussian mixes, which doesn't take into account how some things may be more interesting than others in a cluttered environment. So clutter is complicated, and we don't know a ton about how that impacts learning, and probably, and we don't know how it affects it for different children, right? So let's say children who are on a sort of path towards developing what will be diagnosed as ADHD versus not, let's say, or something like that, or kids with ASD. I think it's something to look out for. I mean, as practical advice might say, well, like from a clinical perspective, can you try to vary the environment and see if that influences a particular child's outcomes, right? In a more like uncluttered, simple environment with fewer distractions, right? Now you might do that, but then if it doesn't represent the everyday environments they're in, then then maybe working on strategies so that they can limit it might be better. I mean, I'm not a clinician, so I don't know, but I do think this is a complex problem and one worth thinking about.
Got it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm getting the call to close it up. And I'm sorry I didn't get to the questions, Jessica. Maybe we can, if you reach out, I can talk to Gideon later. We could try to get an answer. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm sorry we gotta cut it, but appreciate you all, and thank you so much, Gideon.
And sorry I wasn't monitoring the chat. I see there are great questions in there. Maybe, but yeah, reach out to me. Maybe there's a way, if somebody copies that, maybe there'd be a way I could answer them offline or address them. I don't know if I'll have answers, but at least I can address them or point them to places where they could look for more information or something.
Yeah, I'm gonna try and catch these questions before we take off, and I'll send them over to you. But thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Gideon, for
absolutely
taking the time to talk to me, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice talking to you. Take care, everyone.
All right, bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.